Chef Oliveira, thank you so much for joining us on Lost in Mexico. The purpose of this podcast is to move beyond the narco-centric narratives about Mexico that have historically predominated the foreign press and tell interesting stories about Mexico based on conversations with Mexicans. And, you know, for us, it's a real privilege to have you here, as you are a visionary of Mexican cuisine and, interestingly enough, the owner of the top-ranked Mexican restaurant in the world and the top-ranked US restaurant in the world. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Welcome to Pujol.
I want to start with your personal story because one thing that intrigues me is that it feels as if your personal story has actually mirrored the transformation of Mexican cuisine, so to speak. And you obviously wanted to become a chef many years ago, but then decided to go and pursue culinary school in the US as opposed to in Mexico. Tell me about why you decided to make that decision.
Well, back then, cuisine in Mexico was not as popular. So most people that came into kitchens, it wasn't optional. It was more something that happened in their lives. There was not a lot of culinary schools in Mexico. There were a couple of like quick certificates, and my father was very keen on me having a bachelor's degree. So we started looking elsewhere. We looked in Europe and several schools in the US. We saw a couple in Mexico, and then the first time I went to the school in New York, it was like for a kid going to Disneyland, no? Like seeing so many people, so many chefs there, it immediately felt like home. So that's the reason I went to school in the US.
Was it the case that at the time in Mexico, the level of sophistication when it came to the formalized training of cooks just wasn't there?
I think in Mexico, Mexican food has belonged at homes and in markets, but restaurants didn't do Mexican food in a higher level. Most fine dining restaurants in Mexico when I was young were French or Japanese or even Italian, no? But the concept of a fine dining Mexican establishment is something that didn't exist before, and it still is challenged by some people here in Mexico. Whether Mexican food can be prepared at that level is obviously something that we're trying to do. Most of the culinary training, therefore, happened at home. So the techniques were learned from generation to generation, not necessarily as a craft, but more as a family treasure or a family recipe. So I think that is the big change and one of the reasons that there wasn't as many culinary schools. Obviously that has changed drastically. There are more and more culinary schools in almost every corner of the country. Cooking has become a profession and a career choice for people in my generation and for a lot of young men and women in Mexico.
So in 2000, you start Pujol, and you are using Mexican ingredients, but you are not cooking Mexican dishes. Tell me about that. Why did you decide to do that?
It wasn't like a decision. It was simply my training in New York was with European techniques. When I was in the United States, I saw a movement of the new American cooking with Alice Waters, with Larry Forgione, with people that were reimagining what American food was. And when I came here in Mexico, it made sense that that movement can happen in Mexico because we have such rich culture here. So little by little, we started working with ingredients, but because my training was in European cuisine, we started with European techniques and some Mexican products, and then little by little, we started incorporating not only those products, but recipes and ideas. But we never wanted to create something that was a mix, but actually something that felt more intuitive.
Were you ever worried subconsciously at the time that if you started doing Mexican cuisine and a fine dining restaurant, that there just wasn't a market for that?
I actually never thought of a market. We were cooking out of passion. We never did like market research on on whether the food was going to sell. Obviously, the first few years were very hard. There's not a lot of people that walked into Pujol's tables. I think also the problem was that the concept was not well-rounded. The food, like I said, was a little European with some Mexican ingredients. The name was Spanish. The locale was minimalistic, so it didn't make sense. No, it took us a while. I graduated in 1999, and we opened Pujol in 2000. So I didn't have a lot of training in my background. We were basically learning as we cooked, and the first 3 or 4 years were really, really rough. And then we started finding a voice. Because there was not a lot of people coming into the restaurant, we started thinking like, what are we doing wrong? And we saw a lot of the street food carts being busy. So we said that's what people want to eat, no? If people want to eat quesadillas and they want to eat esquites and they want to eat tacos, that is something that we should incorporate into our language. And that started happening in 2004. So our first incursion into Mexican cooking was not with the celebratory dishes or the big dishes of Mexico, but more street food inspirations that started appearing in our menu, and also things that I remember from childhood and childhood memories from my mom cooking at home.
So you start Pujol in 2000 at the age of like 24. Then you start Cosme in 2014 in New York. Both of these restaurants are now seen as the pinnacle of Mexican fine dining. You've spoken a little bit about how you wanted to change the Western perception that Mexican food is cheap and easy. Do you think you've done that?
I think we have done that through generations. No, this is not something that we're not isolated in history. It does coincide, with the latest years. People recognizing that Mexican food can also be sophisticated, can also be performed in a higher level, but it's something that Ricardo was building, myself have built on that heritage, and now the younger generations are also part of that conversation. So we see our Mexican food as a continuum. We didn't break with tradition, and there were a lot of chefs. Monica Patiño, for instance, is one of the people that I admire in my younger years as a chef, and they paved the road for us. There's a really nice restaurant called Empellón in New York. The chef is Alex Tupac, and he was one of the first that started doing Mexican cuisine at a higher level. So if he didn't come in before we did with Cosme, probably the history would be different. So it would be incorrect to say that we built this movement. No, it's actually a collective effort.
I want to ask you about Mexican labor in the US, because there are so many Mexican workers who are working in the restaurant industry who have traditionally been poorly treated, underpaid, and subject to a lot of discrimination. Do you think that a lot of your restaurants in the US have helped to change the way that Mexican labor is valued?
I think there's a sense of pride that comes to working in a restaurant like Cosme or like Pujol. There's, of course, there's the craft, but there's also a cheerfulness of understanding that people are giving a different value to a tortilla. So I think what we're trying to do is not only change the perception of the customer, but also change the perception of the producers and the people that work in the restaurant, so that they feel pride in their job, they feel pride in their culture, and they understand that that culture also belongs in a fine dining restaurant.
And is one of your priorities in terms of changing the perception of producers is to make sure the producers are properly remunerated for their work, which you don't necessarily get when it comes to cheap food?
Yes, absolutely. And it's something that we practice in every restaurant. In Pujol, in Cosme, in Atla, we like to work with small producers. We like to engage with their practices. It's not only about the quality of the product, it's the people that grow the food for us. Obviously, when you have a good tomato, the probability that somebody was taking good care of the soil and of the plant is high. But it is also very important, because we're not, if something taught this current crisis has taught us, is that we're part of a community, and the food system, you're not isolated. So you need to make sure that you have those strong connections with the farmers.
Chef Oliveira, I want to ask you how you feel about particular criticism towards your restaurants, because we have many Mexican friends who say, Chef Oliveira has done a wonderful job in terms of being an ambassador of Mexican cuisine to foreigners, and teaching foreigners about Mexican cuisine, and teaching foreigners to value Mexican cuisine. But, most Mexicans can't afford to eat at Pujol, and, should Pujol be so expensive when there is excellent food at street vendors and in markets? Do you think sometimes it's easier to convince foreigners of the value of your food rather than Mexicans?
I mean, it's a conversation about quality, and of course we want everybody to earn better wages in Mexico. I think the idea would be not to produce cheap food, but actually increase the wages of everyone. So that is something that we practice at the restaurants. The salaries that we paid in Pujol are much higher than the average in the industry. So I think the conversation shouldn't be if Mexican food should be cheap, but if Mexicans should earn more for their work.
I want to ask you specifically about your relationship with mole, because I know it has been a very defining dish for you. What does mole mean to you?
Mole is a celebratory dish. Every family and every town have their recipe of a mole. Since Pujol is a celebratory restaurant, a lot of people come here for their birthdays, for anniversaries, or for a special occasion. We thought that it was proper for us to have our own version of a mole, our own recipe. The recipe that we like more is the black mole from Oaxaca. That's the mole that we enjoy the most. And our recipe of the mole madre is based on black mole recipe. We changed certain things because our mole belongs in a tasting menu, and we never create dishes on isolation. But actually, if you're thinking about music, we're not doing a song, we're doing an album. So the mole belongs into a tasting menu, and that's why we don't serve it with chicken. And then the preparation of the mole, because we do it year round, we use different fruits and different spices through the year. So that recipe is changing depending on what fruits we can get in season. So those are the two main reasons, and that we have a mole at the menu. And then the idea, Ricardo taught me about a 7-day-old mole more than 15 years ago. And I never thought of it much, but when we were trying to make our mole recipe for an anniversary of Quintonil, we, instead of doing it 7 days, we said we're gonna do double, see what happens. So we reheated the mole for 14 days for the anniversary of Quintonil, and then we started just doing it permanently. So it's a reheating process, because in Mexico, people say that the mole on the next day of the wedding tastes better. Kind of what happens in other countries with multiple recipes. Now I can think of, for example, like turkey on Thanksgiving, and Thanksgiving turkey on the next day on a sandwich. The things that you reheat are normally more flavorful.
So you've spoken about mole in the context of cultural appropriation. And specifically what I want to ask you about is, there are a lot of people who think that there are all these non-Mexican chefs coming to Mexico, taking the recipes of locals, and then going back to the US or anywhere else in the world and profiting off that. You were in the Atlantic a few years ago saying that you thought that the idea of cultural appropriation in food was absurd, and you used mole as an example. Talk me through that.
Mexicans are fantastic at cultural appropriation, no? Talk about taco al pastor, no? That's a Lebanese kebab. We took cilantro from Asia, and you make it yours. So I think, of course, there's concerns about cultural appropriation everywhere in the world, but I think in cooking, if you're respectful, no, and you give credit to the people that I don't believe that I created mole, no, and I don't believe that the tortilla belongs to anyone. No, the recipe of a margarita is also public domain. Nobody can say that the margarita belongs to them, even if you create it. No, because when you're creating, you're not creating from zero. You're obviously incorporating ideas from your life, of things that you have tasted. So with mole, it's a little bit the same. No, of course there are moles that are native, that are pre-Columbian, but the moles, for example, the conventional moles like the mole poblano is a mix of cultures. So I think in cooking cannot exist without a certain degree of cultural appropriation.
So given that you think that most dishes are an amalgamation or an effusion of so many different cultures, is there an authentic Mexican dish?
Depends on, I would say there's regional dishes in time periods, no, but you can say that not only about Mexican food, you can say that, I don't know, if you think about pasta with tomatoes, that cultural appropriation from noodles from China and tomatoes from Mexico, no, it starts to become, I think, difficult, that conversation to say who owns what, no, and I personally think it's better to think that no, food belongs to everyone.
So I want to ask you about sort of farming practices and sustainability, which you touched on before, because I know that you, for example, like to buy some of your produce from producers in Xochimilco who use more sort of Aztecan and sustainable farming practices. What would you say to the Monsantos of the world who say that it is cheaper and more efficient to produce food that feeds a lot of people using things like genetically modified crops?
I think the issue with industrialized food production is that, first of all, it's a system that is geared towards concentration of wealth. And the idea of food production should be the wealth of food production belongs to the community. To me, the simple idea of a company profiting from a seed for all the farmers makes no sense. I think seeds are deposits of culture, and they have been nourished by the community through generations, and I think that makes a lot more sense in terms of food production. And obviously monoculture destroys the soil. The soil is the patrimony of the community, and we have to take care of it as a collective. I don't see in corn a commodity. I see in corn an expression of diversity, an expression of climate, and as a wealth of our culture.
So you don't think that even if there is an ability to feed more people, that should be, I suppose, prioritized in favor of, over and above preservation of diversity?
I mean, if the system was successful, you couldn't argue with success, right? But we can all see the results.
I have to ask you about the controversy surrounding an article that you wrote in Reforma, expressing some frustration with, entitled people who come into Pujol and expect to be served lemon and chili with their dishes. And the Twitter sphere was very quick to respond and suggest that you were actually being entitled. Tell me what your reflection is on all of that.
Well, the idea was not to say that people that come to Pujol are entitled. I was giving examples on for example, the idea of adding lemon to a nigiri in a fine Japanese restaurant. I think you're not respecting the work of the sushi chef. And I was talking more about them than we're talking about Pujol in the context of the pandemic, which I think it's also important to say that. No, the idea was not complaining about customers adding chile to our dishes. We add chile ourselves, and lemon to most of the dishes in Pujol have lemon and chile. But it's more about respect to others and how you should wear a mask, and be courteous, and don't double park, which is something that happens in Mexico too. There's sometimes I wish there would be more respect for the work of others. So I was talking about that, not complaining about customers.
I want to ask you about the way that you value your own work. Chef Munoz described you as an artist. Do you consider yourself an artist?
No, I think I'm in love with things that are well made, and I do have a passion for that. It gives me a lot of joy when I go into a space that is beautiful, when I cook food that is clean and elegant and delicate. There's a sensibility for that, but I don't know if I'm an artist. If I had to say yes or no, I would probably say no.
So you wouldn't consider your creations as works of art?
No, it's a dedication. It's a life passion. It's a way of understanding our life. But I see it more as a series of connections than a work, in a workshop isolated.
You are one of the most prominent Mexicans in the world because of the work that you've done. I know that you've previously expressed some concern about children at the border. This year is an election year.
Yeah.
Are you worried about the re-election of Trump and what that might do to Mexico-US relations?
Of course, I'm concerned about the re-election of Trump. I think the discourse of polarization that has happened in the U.S. is not positive for anyone, not only for Mexicans. Even though I am in love with my country, I'm not a nationalist. I don't believe in a strong national sentiments. Like I said, even if I love the food of Mexico, it's not something that we intend. I believe in humanity, in the links between countries, in regions, and I think the election of Trump, or the re-election of Trump, attempts on that, and the separation of families and the polarization of society.
It's interesting to hear you say that you don't consider yourself a nationalist. Do you think that belief is inherent in your food in some ways? Because you don't believe in sort of cultural appropriation in Mexican cuisine, because Mexican cuisine is a fusion of so many other different types of cuisines.
Yeah, it's about being human, and not where you're from. There's a lot of Mexicans that are not born in Mexico, we're saying that Chavela Vargas said, Mexicans can choose wherever they want to be born. So I think in that sense, we need to understand that we're all in this boat together. There's no nationalities. There's no winning between nations. There's no. I don't see a benefit to that. I see more of a dialogue and a harmony between humans than national power.
So you're opening up a new restaurant in LA. Very exciting.
Thank you.
When you opened up Cosme, you said that it was a very unique experience for you because you were entering into a market that was not really familiar with Mexican cuisine. Now you're going into LA,
Yes.
where there are some Mexicans living in LA. There's obviously such a strong historical and cultural link between Mexico and LA. Tell me about what the challenges are involved in entering into that type of market.
We understand that California has its own Mexican cuisine. I almost see it as a different regional cuisine of Mexico, just as there's the cuisine from Oaxaca or Yucatan, or Mexico City. I think California has its own version of Mexican cuisine, and we're taking that into consideration. I think the sentiment is kind of the same, but the context is very different. I was there yesterday, and we were doing menu trials, and it felt, to be completely honest, a lot like Cosme. It felt like that start of something that is new, that you know what you want, but you don't know where you're going, because also I think the reality of California will kind of will set the road for us. We're not, of course, you have an idea on your mind on where you want the restaurant to go, but then the restaurant kind of takes the life by itself. It's when we opened Cosme, we never thought that Cosme was going to be the kind of restaurant that it became. No, it was supposed to be a casual, more festive restaurant. No, and it became a lot more celebrated than expected. So you never know when you open a restaurant what's going to happen. But I do feel that with California, I feel a little bit more at home, maybe because there's such a strong presence of Mexicans there, and I think I feel like a immediate connection to the culture of California, and we want to be part of that. We're not there to carry the flag of authenticity. We love California products. It's, I think, one of the best places on earth to cook. The quality and the flavors of the ingredients there is amazing, and we just want to cook those ingredients.
I'm intrigued by what you say in terms of California being almost another state of Mexico in terms of its cuisine. Do you consider Tex-mex to be similar?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Do you like Tex-mex?
I like it when it's well prepared. You know what the problem with Tex-mex is sometimes is that we also and this is something that we need to work on, but you normally relate it to fast food. So you relate it to poor quality tortilla shells or poor quality ground up beef, but those are stereotypes, and that has happened to Mexico, so I'm not going to fall into that trap. And I think if you prepare good quality Tex-mex, of course it's delicious.
So I should see you at Chipotle lining up for a burrito.
I've eaten in Chipotle before, yes.
So it's 20 years since you opened Pujol. It's a pretty incredible landmark achievement. This year has obviously presented some challenges because of COVID. Tell me about how you've tried to navigate through those challenges.
I guess in March, what we were thinking was this was going to take a few months to get over, but now that we understand that it'll take a little bit longer, what we're trying to do is understand what's going to happen to us and how we would like the restaurant to be more than the pandemic itself. Of course, we are concerned with the sanitary crisis and the economic crisis, but those things are completely out of our control. No, we cannot control how the pandemic is evolving and the economic crisis of our industry in specific. What we can control is the experience of Pujol, certain changes that we did. For example, here on the restaurant was opening our terrace for a la carte people with no reservations. So there's little things that we're changing. We're still convinced that people enjoy really good food, and I think that is something that will survive the pandemic. So we know that it might take us a few months more or even a year more, but it will finish at some point. So right now we just need to be skinny and flexible to make sure that we can survive the pandemic, and then after that we'll come back hopefully as strong as ever.
Are you concerned about the restaurant industry?
Of course, there's so many closings. No, there's so many people suffering, and not only employees but also producers, and farmers that depend on those restaurants because they have no distribution channel through supermarkets. So of course I'm concerned. I think this situation for restaurants has been really challenging and continue to be challenging for a good period of time. Now some people are saying maybe March, April. Other people are saying December of 2021. So it will be really hard. You have to be on top of your game right now. I think right now you have to also make sure that you're performing well in every level, not only in the gastronomic or in the hospitality, but also in the financial. Everything needs to be very precise. Right. So there's very little room for mistakes right now.
So 20 years ago you opened Pujol. Now you sit here 20 years later with two of the best restaurants in the world. Where is Enrique Olvera in 20 years' time?
Hopefully in a farm. Hopefully in a farm or somewhere in the countryside. I really enjoy nature. I love simple life. So hopefully not in 20 years, maybe 15.
Just retire to somewhere luxurious, retire to Oaxaca?
Yes, Oaxaca or the mountains or the ocean. I also really love restaurant industry, so I'll probably stay involved in some capacity in restaurants, but I started really young, and I truly believe that it's also time to let other generations take care of the industry, and hopefully these other people will continue the legacy of Ricardo and the legacy of our work.
How would you describe the ride?
The ride has been fantastic. Yeah. It's crazy. I mean, if you think about it, when we opened Pujol, we had 40 seats in a very small location. Of course, we wanted to have a beautiful restaurant, but we never expected to grow into this restaurant collection, and we're very proud. And I think the most beautiful part is that the people that work for the restaurants also have become part of the family, and they have interiorized those values. And to me, that is the best part of the ride, is that there's now people that a lot of people, there's hundreds of employees in the company that have that same vision of Mexican food.
Thank you so much, Chef Oliveira, for joining us today. That was such a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you.